Before we begin, if you're new here, welcome to Rise from the Ashes. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a story. And if anything I share today feels familiar, if you've been the invisible one, the overlooked one, the one they only called when they needed something, leave a comment below. I read every single one. Now let's go back to the beginning. My name is Vivian Cole, and for the first 22 years of my life, I was someone else's shadow. Not metaphorically. Not in the way middle children sometimes say they felt invisible or overlooked or a little less loved. I mean it in a very specific, very deliberate, and, as I would eventually discover, very calculated way. My sister Natalie didn't just overshadow me.
She used me.
She built her entire life on top of mine, piece by piece, like someone quietly taking bricks from the foundation of your house to build a patio for theirs. By the time I understood what she had done, the damage was so structural I didn't know which parts of my life were still mine. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it started. In a beige house on Clement Street in a mid-sized city in Ohio, with a mother who meant well in the abstract, a father who worked nights, and a sister who was, from the very beginning, the sun around which our entire family orbited. Natalie was 3 years older than me. She had our mother's cheekbones, our father's easy confidence, and a quality I can only describe as gravitational. People moved toward her without understanding why. Teachers remembered her name after one class. Neighbors brought her cookies just because. At family gatherings, relatives would cup her face in their hands and say, this one is going to do something." Then they'd glance at me, briefly, politely, and say, "And you must be the little one." I was always the little one, even after I turned 16 and was 2 inches taller than Natalie. Even after I started outscoring her in every subject at school. In the emotional geography of our family, I was still the background, the afterthought, the spare. I told myself it didn't bother me. I was a good liar, even to myself. The first thing Natalie ever took from me was my place on the school debate team. I had practiced for 3 weeks. I had filled a blue notebook with arguments I still have somewhere. The morning of tryouts, Natalie, who had never once expressed interest in debate, walked in and delivered a 4-minute off-the-cuff argument about federal housing policy that made the coach cry. She took the only open junior slot. I stood in the hallway afterward and told myself it was fine. There would be other things. There were other things. Natalie took those too. The scholarship I had quietly researched and applied for. She found my application on the shared family computer and submitted her own the same afternoon, with a recommendation letter from the principal she had somehow charmed out of him in 2 days. She won it. I found out at dinner when my mother announced it with the kind of pride that fills a room so completely there is no air left for anyone else. The hospital internship I had lined up through my biology teacher. Natalie mentioned she was also interested in medicine at a family barbecue where the hospital's HR director happened to be a guest. 2 weeks later, the internship was a 2-person placement. Natalie was given the patient-facing role. I was moved to filing. Each time, I told myself the same thing. She doesn't mean it. She's just competitive. She doesn't even realize she does it. I told myself that for 17 years. Then I found the folder. I was 22. Natalie was 25. She had moved to Chicago after college for a marketing job, and I was still in Ohio finishing a nursing degree at the State University, working nights at a diner to cover the gap between my partial scholarship and my actual tuition. I was at her apartment for a weekend visit. In retrospect, I cannot explain why I kept trying to have a relationship with her, except that I was still, at 22, hoping that the version of Natalie who existed in my imagination, the one who loved me, who was proud of me, who would one day really see me, would eventually show up. She never did. But I found something else instead. It was Saturday morning. Natalie was at a spin class. I was making coffee and I knocked a stack of papers off her counter, the kind of clumsy accident that happens in small kitchens, and when I bent to pick them up, a folder slid out from between 2 magazines and fell open on the tile floor. The tab said, in Natalie's handwriting, "Vivian, Useful documents. I stood up slowly. I set the folder on the counter. I poured my coffee. I sat down at the kitchen table. And then I opened it. Inside, photocopies of my birth certificate, a copy of my social security card, a scan of my high school transcript, mine with my GPA and my honors designations, a copy of a recommendation letter my biology teacher had written specifically for me, with Natalie's name written over mine in pencil, as though she'd been practicing the substitution. 2 sets of standardized test scores under my candidate ID. 3 scholarship application essays in my handwriting, with Natalie's name typed at the top. And at the very back, in a clear plastic sleeve, a credit card. In my name, with a billing address I had never lived at. I sat at that kitchen table for a very long time. I thought about all the times I had applied for things and been rejected without explanation. The 2 apartments I hadn't been able to rent despite having a job and a cosigner. The student credit card that came back declined when every calculator said I should qualify. The strange credit inquiry alerts I had signed up for and ignored because I didn't understand what triggered them. I thought about a conversation 6 months earlier when I'd mentioned to Natalie that I was worried about my credit score. She said, very casually, "Oh, you probably just don't have enough history yet. You need to build it up." She said it the way you say something when you already know the answer and you are not interested in the other person figuring it out. I put the folder exactly where I found it. I finished my coffee. I washed the mug. I left a note saying something had come up and I had to go home early. Then I drove 2 hours back to Ohio and did not cry until I was inside my apartment with the door locked. Then I cried for a very long time. I want to be careful here because this is the part people find hardest to believe. Not the betrayal. People accept betrayal easily enough. The patience is what surprises them. The absolute stillness of what I did next. I did not confront Natalie. I did not call my mother. I did not go to the police. Not yet, not that day, not with what I had. A folder I had no right to examine and photographs on my phone, and a suspicion that was still just a suspicion. Instead, I did what I always do when the world feels like it's collapsing. I made a list. And then I worked the list. Over the next 4 months, I pulled my full credit report and went through it line by line. 3 credit cards opened in my name at addresses I had never lived at. A personal loan from 2019 that had gone to collections. A medical bill from a Chicago clinic for services rendered in 2021, a date when I had been in Ohio working a double shift, time-stamped punch card to prove it. I documented everything. I built a file that was, by the time I finished, 112 pages long. A timeline, dollar amounts, dates. In some cases, actual receipts because Natalie had, with astonishing carelessness, used my identity to purchase things shipped to addresses connected to her own accounts. I got a legal consultation. The attorney told me what I had was serious. She told me the options. She said identity theft of this duration and scale carried real criminal consequences and asked how I wanted to proceed. I told her I wasn't ready yet. She looked at me across the desk and said, "Most people in your situation want to move as fast as possible." "I know," I said. "I'm not most people." What she didn't know, what almost no one knew, was that I had a reason to wait. Not just strategy. Something that had been growing in the back of my mind since I drove home from Chicago, something I hadn't let myself look at directly, because looking at it meant admitting something about my sister I still wasn't fully ready to admit. Natalie had not just stolen my credit. She had stolen my identity in the truest sense, my documented history, my academic record, my professional paper trail, and used them to build a version of herself that was more credible, more accomplished, more fundable than the real Natalie actually was. She had been doing it, by my best calculations, since I was 15 years old. 10 years. 10 years. I finished my nursing degree. I passed my boards on the first try. I got a job at a hospital 60 miles from home, in a city where nobody knew my family, and I started over with a credit freeze, a fraud alert, and a very clear understanding of exactly what my life was actually worth once I had removed a decade of my sister's fingerprints from it. I was 24 years old, starting from zero, and completely, unexpectedly free. The next 6 years matter, so let me tell you about them. I worked in the oncology ward at Mercy Regional. I specialized in hematology nursing, blood disorders, transfusions, bone marrow cases because it was the hardest rotation and I have never been able to walk away from hard things. My supervisor, Margaret, a 30-year veteran, told me at my one-year review that I had the best clinical instincts she'd seen in a new nurse in a decade. I saved that piece of paper. I read it sometimes when the doubt came back. I rebuilt my credit from scratch. 3 years to get it back to where it should have been. Another 2 to get it where I actually wanted it. I bought a small house at 28, 2 bedrooms, original hardwood floors, a backyard that needed work, and I painted every room myself over a long weekend in October, listening to the same playlist 3 times through. I did not tell my parents what Natalie had done. I made a deliberate choice about this. My mother was not complicit. She simply loved Natalie louder, in that absorbed way that some parents have that isn't malice, just terrible math. My father had worked so many nights that he had missed most of what went on inside our house. They did not deserve to be detonated. But I stopped performing closeness with Natalie. My calls home became shorter. Visits less frequent. When Natalie called, which she did, occasionally, with the breezy, distracted energy of someone who had no idea there was a loaded document on a hard drive with her name on it, I was polite and brief and gave her nothing she could use. She noticed eventually. She called once and said, "Are you mad at me about something? You've been weird for like a year." I said I wasn't mad, just busy. She said I could tell her if something was wrong. The audacity of that sentence. Even now it catches me somewhere soft. I kept building. I became a charge nurse. I enrolled in a part-time master's program in healthcare administration. I made real friends, the kind who show up when things are hard and need nothing in return. I started running. I got a large, deeply ridiculous rescue greyhound named Cabinet who slept on my couch despite all rules and greeted me each evening like I'd returned from war. I was not happy every day, but I was building something slowly and carefully, brick by brick. And every brick was mine. My master's program changed me in ways I hadn't anticipated. I had gone in thinking I was building credentials. What I found instead was a framework for thinking about how institutions work, who they serve, who they fail, where the gaps are. I wrote a thesis on care continuity for low-income hematology patients. My faculty advisor called it the angriest compassionate document she had ever assessed. I took it as a compliment. I also rebuilt my relationship with the concept of family. Not my original family, but the people who showed up consistently. My colleague Dana, who appeared at my door with soup whenever I was sick without being asked, my running partner Jerome, who in 4 years of early mornings never once asked me to explain myself and seemed to find my quietness restful, Margaret, who retired the year I made charge nurse and sent a card that said simply, "I told you so." These were my people, chosen rather than assigned, not perfect, mine. Cabinet turned 6 the month before the phone call from my mother. He had become, over those years, slightly less ridiculous and noticeably more dignified. A transformation I found both admirable and personally relatable. He still slept on the couch. I had stopped pretending to mind. There were harder months too. A period in year 3 when the accumulated weight of starting over, the credit rebuilding, the night shifts, the master's coursework, the deliberate loneliness of keeping my family at distance, pressed down in a way that felt genuinely unsustainable. I saw a therapist for 8 months, not because I was falling apart, but because I had learned by then that maintenance is not weakness. It is the opposite. I worked through a lot of what had happened in Ohio. I worked through what I was still carrying from it. I came out the other side of those 8 months lighter in a way that was harder to articulate than I had expected, but undeniable. Then, on a Tuesday morning in February, my mother called at 7 a.m. She was crying before I even answered. "It's Natalie," she said. "She's sick. Here is where I need you to sit with me for a moment, because what comes next is not what you are expecting. It is not what I expected either, and I had spent 6 years preparing for almost every version of this story. Natalie had been diagnosed 3 weeks earlier with acute myeloid leukemia, a fast-moving blood cancer. She was 34 years old. She was in a hospital in Chicago. She had already started an aggressive treatment protocol that was not working as well as her oncologist had hoped, and she needed a bone marrow transplant. My mother told me all of this in pieces, between tears. She told me the doctors had tested both parents and neither was a suitable match. She told me a donor registry search was underway. And then, in a voice trying very hard to be steady, she said, "They said a sibling is the best chance. Vivian, I need you to get tested." I sat down on my kitchen floor. Cabinet put his long gray head in my lap. Outside, the morning was blue and very still. I had imagined, in my more dramatic moments over the past 6 years, a confrontation, a reckoning, some version of justice where Natalie was finally held accountable, finally seen for what she had done, finally unable to use me because I had removed myself from the equation. I had not imagined this. I told my mother I needed a few days. She asked how many. I said I didn't know. She went quiet, then said something I've thought about almost every day since. "I know you and your sister aren't close. I know some of that is my fault. But she is still your sister." "I know," I said. I hung up. I sat on that kitchen floor for a long time. I want to tell you what I did next came from pure goodness. From some reservoir of grace I'd been quietly filling without realizing it. I want to give you the clean story. Wronged sister rises above it, does the right thing, receives her acknowledgement. The truth is messy. I spent 48 hours being genuinely, profoundly angry. I called my attorney and asked her clinically what my options were if I chose not to be tested. I sat in my hospital parking lot one evening watching the lit windows and thought through every version of this choice, not just morally but in my gut, in the place where you live with yourself. And from every angle, I kept arriving at the same place. I was a hematology nurse. I worked bone marrow cases. I had held the hands of patients waiting for donor matches that never came. I knew, better than almost anyone outside a clinical setting, exactly what the difference was between having a matched sibling donor and not having one. I could not unknow what I knew. I called my mother back Thursday morning and said I would go get tested.
She cried.
I told her not to tell Natalie yet.
She asked why.
I said I would explain when the time came. I drove to Chicago on a Sunday. I did not tell Natalie I was coming. I arranged the testing through the hospital's transplant coordinator, a calm, efficient woman named Dr. Osei, who asked no unnecessary questions, for which I was immediately grateful. The testing was simple. A blood draw,
a cheek swab,
a form. Dr. Osei told me results would take about 10 days. After the appointment, I went to room 412. I had prepared myself for Natalie to look bad. I had prepared, honestly, for that complicated thing that happens in a human heart when someone who has hurt you is suffering. That mixture of genuine sadness and the darkest, most shameful flicker of something adjacent to satisfaction that you do not tell anyone about. What I had not prepared for was how young she looked. Natalie had always been the beautiful one. That was simply fact, not complaint. She had a face that photographs well from every angle and an energy that made rooms feel more alive. Lying in a hospital bed with Infor in her arm and no makeup, and her hair pulled back with the particular flatness of someone who hadn't been well enough to wash it properly in days, she looked 20. She looked like the sister from childhood, before I understood what was happening, when we shared a room and she would whisper stories to me in the dark until I fell asleep. When I walked in, she looked at me and her face did something I had never seen it do before. It crumpled. Not gracefully, not dramatically, just crumpled, like a piece of paper no one was going to need anymore. She said my name in a voice I didn't recognize. Viv. I sat in the chair beside her bed. I didn't speak for a moment. I looked at the monitors, the 4-line, her hands folded in her lap, and I noticed, in the clinical part of my brain that never fully goes off duty, that her color was poor, that she looked worse than I had hoped. I got tested this morning, I said. We'll know in 10 days. She started to cry. She reached out and took my hand, and I let her because I am a complicated person and the world is a complicated place, and the person who stole 10 years of your documented life can simultaneously be the person you grew up with and the person who does not yet know that you know everything. We sat there a long time. She asked how I was. I told her I was well. She told me about the diagnosis, how fast it came on, the terrifying speed of it, the treatment that bought time but not enough. She told me she'd been scared. I said I imagined she had been. And then near the end of the visit she said, "I know I haven't been a good sister, Viv. I know there are things I should have done differently." I looked at her. I said, "I know about the folder, Natalie." The room went very still. The monitors beeped. Outside in the hallway, someone laughed at something ordinary, a clean sound from a world continuing normally. Natalie's face moved through several things very quickly. And then, to her credit, to the part of her still the girl who whispered stories in the dark, she didn't lie. She closed her eyes. She said, "I know." "How long have you known that I knew?" I asked. "Since about a year after you went quiet on me," she said. "I went looking for the folder. It was where I'd left it, but I could tell someone had been through the papers. I knew it was you." She opened her eyes.
Red.
"I've been waiting 6 years for you to use it."
I didn't want to use it, I said.
"I wanted you to be who I thought you were." That sentence cost me something real. I could feel it leave. But it also cleared something, some weight I had been carrying for a very long time. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. Not a long apology. Not a detailed one. Quiet, with the texture of something real. "I'm so sorry, Viv. I don't have an explanation that makes it okay." "No," I agreed. "You don't." I stayed another hour. We talked about cabinet. We talked about a lake house vacation in Michigan when we were children. Small, safe things. The way you talk when you're standing at the edge of something enormous and you need a moment before you look down. When I left, she was asleep. I stood in the doorway of room 412 and looked at her. The monitors, the thin hands, the face that looked 20 again, and then I walked down the hallway and out through the automatic doors into the cold February air. I called my attorney from the parking lot. "I need to tell you what's happening," I said. "And I need your advice on what comes next." I was a match. Dr. Osei called on a Wednesday, 11 days after the test. Professional and precise, she told me the compatibility numbers in language I understood completely, which made it both easier and harder. A sibling match of this quality was unusually good, she said. It gave Natalie a significantly improved chance. I told her I needed 2 more weeks before my final answer. She said she understood and would hold the file. During those 2 weeks, 3 things happened. First, my attorney filed a formal dispute on my credit record. Not a criminal complaint, not yet, but the beginning of the paper process that would, over the following 18 months, close 3 fraudulent accounts, remove 2 collections, and discharge approximately $11,000 in fraudulent debt. Natalie knew this was coming. She had known since room 412. She did not contest a single item. Second, I had a long phone call with my mother. I told her about the folder. I told her about the 10 years. The credit cards, the essays, the scholarship, the medical bills. She went completely silent, not the silence of disbelief, but the silence of a person reorganizing everything she thought she understood. When she finally spoke, she said only, "I am so sorry, Vivian.
I didn't see it. I didn't see you."
It was not a complete accounting of everything she had missed, but it was honest, and I believe she meant it. Third, Natalie called me, not to ask about the test results, not to plead. She called and she talked for 40 minutes, and she told me things she had never told anyone about the pressure she'd felt growing up to be exceptional, about the terror underneath all that confidence, about the way she had watched me be steady and capable and unflappable, and had felt, inexplicably, that the only way to compete was to take. She didn't frame it as an excuse. She was clear that it wasn't, but she told me the truth. And that was something. At the end of that call, she said, "Whatever you decide about the test, I need you to know that I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm just asking you to know that I know what I did, and that I'm ashamed of it." I didn't say anything for a long moment. Then I said, "I've already decided." I donated. The procedure itself was straightforward. A peripheral blood stem cell collection, which meant a few days of injections to stimulate production followed by a collection process, through and for. I had explained this procedure to patients and families dozens of times in my clinical work. Being on the other side of it was strange in the way that professional knowledge always feels strange when it becomes personal. All the information in the world doesn't stop your hands from shaking a little in the chair. Natalie was in the hospital for 5 weeks following the transplant. There were complications, a common type, manageable with the right protocol, but frightening in the way that anything in a hospital is frightening when it belongs to someone you grew up with. I drove to Chicago 3 times during those 5 weeks. I sat with her. I talked to her nurses in the language nurses use with each other, the shorthand that is equal parts clinical and human, and I think that mattered to her, not because I could change anything but because she could see that I understood exactly what was happening, and I was still there. My mother came too, eventually. She sat in a chair on the opposite side of Natalie's bed from me, and the 3 of us were in that room together in a way we had never been before. Not performing a family, not maintaining appearances, just 3 people with a very long and complicated history being honest, probably for the first time, about what that history actually was. One afternoon toward the end of Natalie's hospital stay, while she was sleeping, my mother looked across the bed at me and said, very quietly, "I got the math wrong. For a long time, I got the math very wrong." I looked at her. "Yes," I said. "You did." She nodded. She reached over and put her hand on mine, briefly, and then she went back to her book. It was not a scene from a movie. It was small and real, and it was enough. Natalie went into remission 8 weeks after the transplant. I cried when Dr. Osei told me. Standing in my kitchen, cabinet pressing his enormous head against my hip, I cried in a way I hadn't since that first night in my apartment after Chicago. Not from grief this time, but from something that I can only describe as the release of a breath I had been holding for 34 years. Natalie and I are not best friends. I want to be honest with you about that because I think dishonest endings do people a disservice, and the people who listen to stories like this one deserve the real version. We talk. We talk more honestly than we ever have. The credit fraud process is ongoing. Most of it resolved, the last pieces winding down. Natalie has never asked me to stop it. She has, in fact, cooperated with everything my attorney has needed. It is the one concrete way she has found to show me that the apology was not just words. My mother calls me every Sunday now, not to update me on Natalie, not because she needs something, just to talk. It took her 34 years to learn how to do that, and I notice it every single time, and I do not take it for granted. Natalie sent me something in the mail last spring. A blue notebook. Not my original one, I'd lost that years ago, but the same kind, same color, same spiral binding. Inside the front cover she had written, "You earned every page of this. I'm sorry I made you prove it." I put it on the shelf above my desk, next to Margaret's review, and the framed photo of Cabinet looking indignant on the couch he is absolutely not allowed on. I think about that 9-year-old girl sometimes. The one who watched her sister win everything and told herself it was fine, who became so good at being invisible that she forgot, for a while, that being seen was something she was allowed to want.
She was wrong about that.
And it only took her a decade of rebuilding, a 112-page file, a bone marrow transplant, and one crumpled face in room 412 to finally understand it. Some things cost exactly as much as they need to, and some things, the true ones, the ones that last, are worth every single cent. That was Vivian's story. And if some part of it stayed with you, if you've been the one they overlooked, the one they only called when they needed something, the one who built something real while everyone else took the credit, you are not alone. There are more stories like this one right here on this channel. Subscribe if you haven't already. Ring that bell. Leave a like if this one meant something to you. And drop a comment. I want to know, have you ever had to decide whether to help someone who hurt you? What did you do? I'll see you in the next one.